Good afternoon, Fides et Politica. We are here back from the summer with another episode, and we are starting a brand new school year. And we have a special guest. We have our co-host Nicholas Miller, myself, Guilherme Brazil de Souza, live from Brazil. But today we have a very special guest, Dr. Jonathan Scriven. Dr. Scriven, could you please introduce yourself to our audience
Well,
and
I'm
tell
gonna
us?
I'm
Yes,
gonna I'm gonna jump in here myself because actually Dr. Scriven really isn't a special guest. He's going to be one of our regular hosts because
right.
he and I are the co-directors of the Center for Law and Public Policy here at Washington Adventist University. And Guilherme and I have been sort of getting this podcast off the ground, but Dr. Scriven is going to be one of the regular contributors and hosts. So we're very happy to have him here. I can introduce him briefly, and then he can add further. He is Associate Director of the Honors College here at Washington Adventist University, co-directs the Center for Law and Public Policy with me. His specialty, his doctorate is in international affairs. He teaches international affairs, public policy, government, and most sort of relevantly, he and I are teaching a course this semester, special 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this coming year. Big celebrations next summer. So we're taking the whole year to celebrate it, and team teaching a course on the Declaration of Independence at 250 years of age. And he can add anything further that he would like.
Yeah, well, thank you both for this. Very happy to be here. So yes, as Nick said, I am the associate director here of the Honors College, as well as a professor of political science. Briefly about the class, obviously this came up because it's timely in terms of the 250th anniversary of the signing, but also because of our location. We're here in Washington, D.C., so this is the seat of government. We're not too far from Philadelphia. So we're about 2 hours from Philadelphia, where the Declaration was signed. And we're also about 2 hours or a little more from the home of Thomas Jefferson, the author. And so this is a really interesting place to be. So very briefly, the idea that we kicked around here with our colleague, Bradford Haas, was to have essentially a three-part series, all focusing on the Declaration of Independence. So this fall, we have one. And this course that Nick and I are teaching together will focus on sort of the period from the beginning of America to about 1750-ish. In other words, we're not going to really even get into the actual Declaration of 1776 until next semester. This semester is going to be a lot more about the background, the political background, philosophical background,
religious background,
of course. But we're going to look a lot also at what colonies were doing on an individual basis in terms of setting up governments. What kind of governments were they? And how did that influence Jefferson and others when they came together to sort of deal with this issue of the oppression of, the British, et cetera. Next semester, our course will dive a little bit more into the process of writing it and all those sorts of things. And then, and here's a little plug, by the way, if you want to get your calendars out, next summer, what we're planning to do now is actually have a conference, 3 or 4 day conference here in Washington, Tacoma Park, on the campus of Washington Adventist University, where we can sort of tie it all together, bring in some guests. So if there are people out there listening who have papers or are interested, get in contact with us, because we'd like to put together a little academic conference coupled with some touring opportunities. We're going to visit Thomas Jefferson's home. We'll go down and see the actual Declaration in Washington. So it's a kind of a full year project, and we're excited about sort of launching it, and getting it out on this kind of podcast is a good way to get that going.
Yeah.
And obviously we're approaching this very important date in America. I would also say world history, right? This was such an important event in terms of politics, of all these individual rights, and in the free church tradition, which is something that we talk a lot here about on the podcast. And tell us a little bit about the reasons for that still make the American Revolution relevant today. Like, why is this date still important? Why is this event, a historical event, so important, even a quarter of a millennium after? And just to comment a little bit on that, the U.S. is a very old republic, right? Republics generally have a lifespan of around 200 years. You look at Rome. So what is it that is so important and so relevant for us today about the American Revolution?
Well, that's a big question that we're going to be exploring for the next 9 months.
Stay tuned.
We had our first class this week, and what we're proposing to do is we read primary documents as well as secondary material, and then a lot of it is class discussion. And what we'd like to do is bring some of the best reports of that class discussion as to observations that are made in relation to how the Declaration especially is relevant today, right? And, I think that's implied in your question, this thing that happened 250 years ago. It really was hugely influential on the formation of democracies in other countries. You go from the Declaration of Independence to the U.S. Constitution. Constitutions are written worldwide based on that. The UN Declaration of Human Rights really is following in the footsteps of the Declaration of Independence. And then, there's more than 120 documents around the world that flow from all of that. So this isn't just about American history. This is about world history and the formation of what we call liberal governments, liberal democracies. And right now we're experiencing a significant pushback against the whole phenomenon of liberal progressive democracies. Classical liberalism is under fire in significant ways around the world, where it's always been under fire, to be fair, but more surprisingly and alarmingly under fire here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And this week we read the Declaration, and in fact, we would challenge our listeners to go, when was the last time you sat down and read the Declaration of Independence from first word to last word, right? I mean, it's a 5-6 minute read.
It's not very long.
But, it's a real reminder, and everyone's familiar with the first paragraph or two, right? The very famous phrases about nature and nature's God. We have to declare the reasons for seeking our independence. And then, of course, the lines that even I've memorized about Creator who has endowed all of
certain unalienable rights, life, liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness. And yet parts of the document relating to the grievances themselves, we were reading through those, and both we and the students were like, wow, some of these issues that seemed so dated and historic are suddenly becoming more relevant to our own day. And Jonathan has marked a number of them here.
So let me pick up on that first, just to get to your question about the relevance. So it's interesting, if you visit Monticello, which I did a couple of weeks ago, because we have a former student who works there and is going to help us with some of these plans. There's a big section dedicated to the international impact of the Declaration. In fact, there's a big sort of a billboard with all of the countries that can directly trace their independence and their documents to the Declaration of Independence. And it's all listed, chronologically. It's very, very powerful, actually, to see that. So there is that angle. But I think the other reason why it's so important for today is specifically because of what Nick just mentioned. Thomas Jefferson and the signers wanted to make sure that this Declaration of Independence was more than just like a quick, breakup, like, oh, I'm breaking up with you, and you're not giving the reasons. They wanted it to be very clear why they were doing it, and they wanted to justify why they were doing it. So not only, the famous part that we all know, when in the course of human events, and, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We've all heard that part. That's the philosophical approach. But in some ways, I don't want to say the more important part, but in some ways, it's that second half that we don't ever read, which is the list of grievances, which is equally as important, because it is the justification. In other words, what Thomas Jefferson is saying is, not only do we want independence, we think we have a right to do it for these specific reasons. And he appeals to nature's law and God's law, etc. So as Nick was saying, and I've just highlighted a couple here, we can look at them. But if you read through the list of grievances that the that Jefferson uses against King George, there are some that, as Nick says, sort of make us ponder as we think about what's happening today. So I'll just read verbatim. Here's one. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislators. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. We're seeing this in the District of Columbia right now with National Guard troops. Also in Los Angeles, where National Guard troops were put in place without the consent of the local government, talking about cutting off trade. As we look at things like...
But let's not speed through that too quickly.
I was just going to list them.
And then go back.
A couple of other examples, cutting off trade, imposing taxes without our consent, which of course is what a tariff is. Constitutionally, I know this is about the Declaration, but constitutionally in America, it's Congress that imposes tariffs. But here we have the executive. So the entire point of the Declaration was to list grievances against a too powerful executive. It's relevant today because some of those same sorts of things are beginning to rear their heads again. For example, depriving us in many cases of a trial by jury, or transporting. Here's one quote, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. We have seen examples of people being shipped overseas, and we're still doing it without due process. And I mean, here, there's not even a trial happening at these places. So it's relevant today, for sure. Let's go back. Okay.
Because go ahead, Guillermo, go ahead. Question?
No, did you want to finish the section, Nick, just to give you the final before we move on?
Well, we were just wanting to talk a little bit more about the detail, which was the one kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the government
consent of the legislature. I have friends who say, well, it's fine. My neighborhood has crime, and let's bring in if the National Guard comes in, crime is going to go down. And, maybe there's some superficial logic to that, but I can tell you that the reason the National Guard is being sent in is not to keep my friend's house safe.
Yeah.
Rather, it's being sent in to project the power of the executive branch into the neighborhoods and streets of our local communities. And of course, we should have police, but we want police in our streets that are accountable to the legislative powers in those communities, right? Because that's how policing and safety and security and fair treatment is sort of kept in balance and kept in check.
Right. And you know what societies were notoriously safe?
Which ones?
Communist Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany.
Yeah, very
current North Korea. In other words, the question
Sharia law, Islamic republics are very safe.
The question isn't whether an overwhelming show of force will make crime go down. The question is at what cost?
Right.
And
the trade-offs.
The trade-off is a police state. So yes, in a police state, there's not a lot of crime, but that's not the issue.
And just to maybe just to your point, Jonathan, what we're saying here, the question isn't police or no police. It's who administers the police, right? Is it the county? Is it the local government who should be responsible for maintaining the security of the local population? Or is it this large, overarching superstructure, right? This nationalist state, which kind of segues to our next question, which is Nick mentioned a little bit this issue of attacks on liberalism abroad and also domestically, right? We have a phenomenon that has become known and that we've talked here on the podcast as Christian nationalism. In Protestantism, you have, theonomy, or in evangelicalism, dominion theology. In Catholicism, you have Catholic integralism. And I wanted to know from both of you, in light of this class that you're teaching, in light of your analysis of current events and how you integrate this with the work you're doing with the students, how does the invocation of nature's God, the laws of nature, and this idea of a creator that is explicit in the Declaration, how does that relate or not relate to the claims of this new phenomenon that has been called Christian nationalism and to these kind of transnational movements that attack these core tenets of liberalism? How do you see this natural idea relating with this nationalism?
So there's a key phrase. Show us, where is the phrase about the
Nature's God?
Yeah.
It's here.
So the second paragraph of the Constitution, well, the first paragraph talks about the laws of nature and nature's God. But then it goes on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And so I asked, what is the significance of that phrasing, self-evident, as opposed to knowing in what other
as you're
kind of
talking,
way?
I'll find the original.
Find the original. And the point that we made was that this stood in contrast to something that could only be understood through special revelation. In other words, you can know certain things about God and the divine through the Bible, but those things aren't self-evident, at least the ones that are specially revealed, the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus Christ, things not self-evident that have to be understood through Scripture. But there is a discussion then of nature and nature's God that everyone everywhere can see, whether or not they have access to the Bible or the Hebrew Scriptures or the Quran, and that therefore this is a kind of political theology that is dependent on general revelation and not tied. It's not, the reason it's not a kind of religious nationalism or Christian nationalism is that it's not drawing on the holy books of either Christianity or any other particular world religion.
So let me just pipe in here. So it's interesting, the word phrase there, self-evident, because that was not originally what Thomas Jefferson wrote. Okay, we all know the phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, if you're a student of American history. Jefferson's original phrase was, we hold these truths to be sacred and unalienable. So, why that change was made is interesting and I think instructive, because it was trying to make sort of the point you made about rights that sort of exist no matter what you could possibly believe.
Religiously, whatever your religion is, there's still this shared experience we have in the world of nature, and there are arguments we can make from nature about the divine and about humanity and about rights that are maybe not accepted by everybody, but the arguments themselves should be able to be understood by everybody. Whereas arguments from the Bible are only accepted by those who believe in the authority of the Bible, right?
And we know now that, so Jefferson lived quite a bit longer after this, another 50 years or so. And when I was at Monticello with this former student of mine, I was asking him about his writings. And he said something very interesting to me. He said that by the time Jefferson got to, the point where he was president and afterwards, he understood intrinsically that anything he wrote on a piece of paper would show up in a history book. I mean, he had self-awareness. He understood that. And we now know that in writing this document, he was not thinking about just the colonies. In other words, he had in mind a movement that could, spread across the country.
And the world.
I'm sorry, I meant the world, around the world. And he understood, I think, not just him, but the other people at the convention, they understood exactly the point you made. We're not all Christians here. Okay, so we can't appeal to the Bible only, because that's going to leave out a vast number of people. So he understood that.
Well, and that's one of the reasons it also doesn't talk about the rights of British persons.
Correct.
Right? It's not framed in terms of the English Declaration of Rights or the Magna Carta, or he wanted to make an argument that would be truly universal in the sense of encompassing all humanity, whether they lived in England, America, India, Africa, South America, and so on. And it amazingly came to fruition.
Yep.
It did, yeah. And obviously, I know I'm the moderator, but just to chime in a little bit on this, it's really interesting to see that he's not proposing this kind of radical anti-religious understanding of the state. But what he's saying is that they just like, and I think of Romans 1 as an example of this. There are truths that individuals are simply without excuse. And the truth that all men are created equal, that they were created. And then you can argue about the God, right? Well, you have to have special revelation for that, but that they were all created and that they all have this common humanity. That is something that people are without excuse, that they cannot deny. And I think one of the problems with Christian nationalism is that it collapses, right? The special and the divine revelation, and it turns it all into natural revelation, kind of what Karl Barth was very critical of, what you saw with Nazi Germany, which is basically this religion is of the people, right? It's something that is born out of the people as opposed to being something separate. And I think something that was very genius about the founders, both especially Madison, I think, was this ability to say that there are truths that we arrive through, that we can all arrive at, but then there's this special revelation, and that's a separate realm that the state cannot infringe upon, and that is beyond the cognizance of state interference. And I think that leads us to another question, and it's something that we've been talking a lot about here, and which is the theme, obviously, of this podcast. And we also hope to see more with Jonathan with us now discussing this, because I also think this is probably something that's very near and dear to you as well. But it's the free church tradition, right? This whole podcast is about promoting the free church tradition, and backtracking a little bit. In both of your studies, both of you have PhDs, are scholars of political history. How has the free church tradition, how have these dissenting Protestant ideals influenced the Declaration of Independence?
So I'll start with that one, because this really does deal with part of my dissertation. So all scholars of American history and constitutionalism and the Declaration would probably unanimously agree that John Locke is a very important figure behind especially the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. The notion of nature and nature's God, and a state of nature, and people coming together for the rulers governed by the consent of the governed, and that they are that people get their rights from God, and those rights are pre-existent to the state, and the state has to safeguard and protect them. All of this is Lockean, and some of the things. And next week we're going to be reading from John Locke and his Second Treatise of Government. And for those interested, we're going to try to include links to that underneath the video here. So for those who want to kind of keep up with the discussion and look at those documents, they're welcome to do so. And in my dissertation, I was able to discover that John Locke, he wrote nearly as much about religion as he did about politics. He was deeply interested. He believed in general revelation, but he also believed in the importance and value of special revelation. And he wrote commentaries on the Bible and commentaries on the book of Romans that are well worth reading. See, I see your eyes opening wide. Political writings, but probably less so with his religious commentary. And I was able to discover that in his early life, he read and took notes on and was influenced by the writings of some free church Baptist leaders back in his day. And I can demonstrate and have shown historically that he had these manuscripts and read them, and that these people used overtly biblical ideas, which Locke then takes and translates into philosophical, more generally accessible ideas. So John Locke himself is a student of, and in some ways at least partially part of, the free church tradition, and expresses their ideas in more sort of accessible modern philosophical thought.
And Nick, I want Jonathan also to answer, but just to finish, compliment that a little bit. You probably already knew this, but he got in touch with an Arminian circle, right, in Holland when he was when he fled with the Earl of Shaftesbury. Yeah, Philip Limbrock, who was an Arminian and who had these ideas of a free church tradition. And just a curiosity, maybe to our Brazilian viewers, the people that are following us, I'm here in the Brazilian Northeast, and we're an hour away from this city called Recife, where we had a Dutch colony in the 1600s, and where we also have the oldest synagogue in the Americas. So the Dutch free church tradition in toleration, it came here to Brazil for 30 years while they were here. And then when the Portuguese kicked them out, they put back the Inquisition, and the Jews, they fled to a place called New Amsterdam. That's currently New York. So that's just an example of how these ideas have influenced the world. But Jonathan, I wanted to hear from you. How do you see this free church tradition in the Declaration?
So I'll just be very frank. That's not my particular area of study. I'll let Nick deal mostly with the free church stuff, to be honest. That's why we make a great team.
His dad has written some wonderful books on it.
My dad would be a great person.
Oh, really?
Podcast. He'd be great on this podcast.
Yeah, let's get him on the roster.
And we'll get him on the roster. I do want to just mention, the thing about Locke is very interesting. Is, obviously, we know the influence of Locke and Rousseau and others. And there was a little bit of pushback during the Constitutional Convention of the Declaration, with claims that it was kind of like recopying from other people. And Jefferson had this very interesting view. So this isn't about the free church tradition necessarily, but I think it's an interesting point just to get into the mindset of Jefferson. So Jefferson wrote to Richard Lee. This is now, almost 35 years later, was talking about his process. And he said, basically he's saying, my goal was not to reinvent something. He said here, and I'm quoting here, the goal here was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place those ideas before mankind, to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. In other words, I just find it interesting that he is so persuaded by some of the arguments of these, religious and political writers, that he is essentially saying, I want to rephrase this in a way that is something that everybody can understand. So it's like taking the theoretical, and this is something that I love in my study of international relations, is to take the theoretical and move it into the practical. And I think that's what Jefferson was doing, because let's face it, for a lot of people, Locke, it's very theoretical, because Locke didn't see this happen in his lifetime, right? It's Jefferson who took those ideas and actually made them be consent of the governed. So it's Jefferson, and of course later the framers of our Constitution. But I think that's just an interesting point about how Jefferson's like, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here.
Although, to be fair, and we'll get into this when we study the states, Locke had quite a bit of influence in the Carolina colonies.
Sure.
Right?
Oh no,
in
for sure.
the government there.
No doubt. Yeah, that is true.
Wow. No, that's I think these are very good points. And I'm really excited to see what you'll explore in the classroom, and maybe be able to share here on further episodes of our podcast. And I also wanted, to Jonathan's point, bring it more kind of to our current events, to what we're witnessing today in the news, in the media. You mentioned how relevant and how alive the Declaration is today, and the Constitution as well, we could say, but the Declaration specifically with these questions of the grievances. And one of the issues that came up this week was an executive order by President Donald Trump, prohibiting flag burnings. So it's an executive order that is related to flag burnings. We know we had the famous case, I think it was 1987, that Justice Antonin Scalia, who's surprisingly extremely conservative justice, ruled in favor of the legality of burning a flag as long as it's yours, right? If you buy an American flag, you can burn it. That was
freedom
kind of
First Amendment.
Exactly. So I mean, I guess maybe this is a question for both of you, right? As a political scientist, we have a political scientist with Jonathan, and a lawyer as well as a historian with Nick. Maybe to tell us a little bit, how does the Declaration, the spirit of the Declaration, inform us about this executive order? Like, what can it tell us about, and also, because we do speak to a religious audience, how do you see both of you, the shape of the country changing with these kinds of attitudes?
How long is the podcast?
Oh yeah.
I mean, some of
Not
these,
3 hours. Not Joe Rogan, but
some of these actions are more symbolic than legal. So, for instance, like executive orders can't make new criminal laws for the general
public.
So
I'll jump in there. So let me jump in there. So you're exactly right. The executive order, which, executive orders have been growing in frequency over the last several presidencies. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the executive order does exactly what you say. It makes flag burning a crime, but it also proposes a sentence. In
Oh,
other words,
wow.
it's a 1-year prison sentence. So
my God.
the way that sort of directly relates to the Declaration of Independence is it's that very sort of thing that the colonists were upset about. The idea that one person, without consulting anybody else, including, the legislature, will propose not only what is or is not legal, but would propose the punishment that goes with it. So there is obviously a direct link there. Now, I'm not sure how far this is going to go, and a lot of what Donald Trump does is performative, and it's baiting. So we'll see.
Sure.
But
so to talk for a moment about the power of executive orders, the reason you can do an executive order is because the president is in charge of the executive branch. So he can issue commands to those employees that are in the executive branch. But this making a law for the general population, this would be knocked over in an instant in the courtroom, because we don't have to talk about the First Amendment. Just to make a law of general applicability with a criminal a sentence attached to it, it's just far beyond the powers of the presidency, unless it was in some military, he was commander in chief, but it just isn't that case. And and then, of course, there would be the First Amendment problems of trying to get such a law when you have a Supreme Court case directly on point. So you may have heard about this veteran from a 20-year vet who went and in protest burned a flag in front of the White House and was immediately arrested and taken away. But the follow-up to that story is that he's not charged with burning the flag.
Correct.
He hasn't been charged under the executive order. He's been charged under a separate regulation, which
setting
apparently
fire in a park. It's a very
prohibits the setting of fires in public parks, outside areas.
It's got nothing to do with the flag at all, actually.
So I don't think he can be sent to jail for a year for doing that either. No. So the government itself knows that this really isn't enforceable.
And I wanted to just ask you both as specialists, because I think this podcast is also an educational podcast. We also want to inform our audience about proper history, proper political science, proper understanding of the law. A lot of talking points I see on these far right, extreme right podcasts is, America had blasphemy laws in the past. The founding fathers did not imagine that we would be allowed to burn the flag. So it's similar to kind of these talking points you see on the far left. You have this appeal to emotion. Don't you love the country? Don't you love America? Why do you defend the right of people to burn that which you love, the country? And I wanted to hear maybe from you as specialists, why is this right so sacred? Why is this something that we as Americans, as Christians, as people who believe in the free church tradition, why is it so important, even if this might seem like a tautology, to defend the rights of those that we disagree with, even for burning an emblem and a symbol that is for some people very dear, like the American flag?
So I'll start and I'll let you finish, Nick. But obviously, it goes without saying, although sometimes I think we forget this. If we all agreed, we wouldn't need these things. In other words, the reason why you put rights in is for the very reason that if you happen to have something to say that is unpopular, you will be defended. So the reason you put the rights, in place in the first place is because there are going to be people who may disagree. And so when it comes to something like burning the flag, it does get quite heated. Okay, that's a sort of an extreme example, but the very fact that you're allowed to do it says a lot about the country that you're living in. In other words, that's sort of the point. Sort of the point is that, yes, even something that sort of personally I might despise is something that is allowed if someone else wants to do it. And that says a lot about the kinds of sort of rights you have in a particular country.
Well, it sort of raises the question, we all agree the flag is a symbol, right? And it's a symbol of what? Is it a symbol of a physical location? Well, yeah, it happens to be these 50 states. But I think that most people who love the flag, it's not just about it's our homeland. It's about what the flag represents, the kind of country we have, liberty and justice for all, right? So if the flag itself represents liberty and freedom, wouldn't it be ironic then if we took the symbol of liberty and freedom and sent someone to jail because they expressed themselves in a way that, appeared to undermine or desecrate the flag? I mean, that's kind of the value and importance of it, is that people get to be free. And as long as it's not somebody else's flag that you've stolen or public property, then you have that freedom, because that's the kind of thing that this country protects and that flag represents.
Well, that's great for us to end. And a final question that I think all of our followers are wanting to know is, where is your class heading? And can our followers, our listeners of the podcast, can they keep up with any of the readings and the material that you're studying in the course?
So absolutely, yes. So this course, it's a typical 3-credit class here this semester, and we can even maybe share sort of our syllabus.
Sure,
share our syllabus, but we'd love to do that. But we can certainly, with each additional sort of podcast, maybe put the readings that we're doing, and we'd love to hear people if they want to do those readings and chime in, on the YouTube page, maybe in the comment section. We'd be happy to get your perspective as well. But as I said at the beginning, this is part 1 of this course. Part 2, and then ultimately we'll end with sort of a culminating thing in June. But we would love to have any kind of engagement or participation, because that's something that's really important to us.
And in fact, maybe we should share with you the one of the books we're reading is Carl Becker's The Declaration of Independence, a study in the history of political ideas. And for this class we just had, we read the first chapter and discussed it. And next week is Labor Day on the class where the Monday where the class happens. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll be reading and discussing Chapter 2, the historical antecedents of the Declaration, the natural rights philosophy.
Yeah.
And so they could get this book. We'll also put up the John Locke, links to the John Locke primary readings. And
the book is so Carl Becker was a longtime professor at places like Cornell University. So the book is actually written 100 years ago. It's still incredibly relevant. It's available on Amazon for, I think, $9 US. So it's not an expensive book to get.
Good.
Fantastic. And I think what we can do for those of you who want to stay up to date on the class, we'll put some links in the description on our YouTube channel, and you can follow up on learning more about this important history, which is the Declaration of Independence. And I'm rooting for you, both of you, across the equator. And I really hope that this class really makes an impact in the lives of these students. And I hope we can also have some of this material here in Brazil. And we have a law school, as I told you, Nick, on the last episode. And I look forward to any future partnerships that we can develop transnationally, preaching the truth that all men are created equal. And that's part of our heritage, of our dissenting, free Protestant, free church tradition. I want to thank you both, Doctors Nicholas P. Miller and Dr. Jonathan Scriven, for being here. And I really hope for more episodes like these, and that we can, in this 100th upcoming 100th year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we can make a difference.
250.
Yes, and I'll give you the final words, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say, it's not the 100th anniversary. It's the
250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Sorry about that. 100th. I was thinking of the church here. Sorry. Yeah, 200. It's 100th of the conference.
Oh, very good. Okay, that's good.
250th anniversary. Yes. Right? A quarter of a millennium of the Declaration of Independence. Longer than the Roman Republic, and we hope that it can continue, even though fingers crossed, right? But gentlemen, any final words, and then we can end.
No, just thank you very much for putting this together. I know we're going to have a good time, sort of working in putting out some more of these things, and I'm happy to do this, and hope we can grow the viewership and get a lot of engagement and dialogue, as you said, across the equator, around the world, wherever people may be.
Good. We'll see you next time.
See you next time, everyone. Thank you for watching another episode of Fides et Politica.
Thank you.
Thank you.